You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to another episode of SLA Insights. Today we have the special privilege of talking with Jesse Scheumann on his new books. His and his wife Marissa collaborated in writing a couple of new books, so I wanted to talk with him a little bit about where he's come from, but especially, of course, about these books that have just come out. So Jesse, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So just to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you've come from, some of your background, and specifically how you've become interested in Hebrew pedagogy and teaching Hebrew?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Midwest, was raised in rural Minnesota. My dad was a pastor. I went to college to study, started studying theology. I didn't think when I started that I was going to do anything with it. I wanted to be a carpenter, but I thought, hey, I should take this time to do theological education. It'll benefit me for the rest of my life. And then, couldn't be done with that. Then I went on to seminary, and I was really thinking about pastoral ministry, but then just kind of continued on and then shifted in more of an academic route, was thinking a PhD in biblical theology. But then something shook me, and I started thinking, well, hold on. A PhD just means that I'm being equipped to be good at one thing. And so what's the one thing I can get equipped at an early age that I can apply the rest of my life and get as much benefit out of? And I thought, hey, well, as an evangelical, especially, like all of our theology is derived from this book, and this book is written in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. And so more fundamental to theology is actually language study. And then I was kind of tracing the fundamental line of thought for Greek or Hebrew. I was like, well, the Old Testament is a foundation to the New Testament. And I was pretty influenced by G.K. Beale's work in New Testament biblical theology. And kind of one way of putting it, he says, every significant New Testament doctrine has its roots in the Old Testament. And basically, to the degree to which we misunderstand that or not even aware of it, to that degree, we're actually probably in danger of misinterpreting what the New Testament has to say. And so that's kind of what took me down Old Testament along the lines, especially through Randall Booth and Biblical Language Center. Both Marissa and I in 2014 were able to do a summer Old Pond. Their one and only year that they were able to do it in the United States, in North Carolina. We did it when we were actually new parents. We had a 2-month-old. And we were crazy enough to not know what we were doing, even as parents, and take this child that we had, successfully kept alive for 2 months and go across the country and study Hebrew together. And not even sure, should we sign both of us up? And we did. And God put, Adam into a deep sleep to be able to make Eve. He put a deep sleep on our daughter for that month. She just slept and slept and slept and slept. And both Marissa and I were able to learn Hebrew.
That's awesome.
And that was actually fundamental to all the Hebrew resources that we've created since then. Now, I did finishing on the academic and degrees side of things. When I made the shift towards language study, and I had done an MDiv and I was working on my THM, and Jason DeRoshi, my supervising professor, told me, if you want to do Hebrew study at a high-powered university, then you're going to have to get another master's. I'm like, I'm not going to get a third master's degree. It's not, not going to happen. He's like, well, then you're not going to study under the kind of person that you would want to. And so I was kind of asking around, and one person told me, Dr. Michael Wise, he's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. And he said, if I were to start over again, I would do a degree in linguistics. I think that's where things are going. And I was in Minnesota, and he said, hey, University of Minnesota, it's a small program, but just because they don't really have that much funding, but it's a good program. And so I applied. Somehow I was one of 2 people accepted. I mean, it was a really small program. And I was able to do an MA in linguistics. And then I was able to do a PhD specialization in Hebrew through University of the Free State, studying under Jacobus and Cynthia Naudea. So that's on the academic side of things.
Okay, great. So where are you now? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I am at Sattler College. It is a small Christian liberal arts college in Boston. And when I found out about the college before it was even launched, I saw that all students, regardless of major, have to take a year of Greek and a year of Hebrew. And there's 5 majors: Bible, business, computer science, history, and I don't know if I said biology. 5 majors, and all students take Greek and Hebrew. And I was like, what?
That's awesome.
Amazing. And so I went into, we were actually at the time just packing to move to a different city close by. But we were packing to move, and my wife and her mother were packing some boxes, and I broke into the door, and I was like, you want to hear about the most amazing school ever? Yeah. So then that's Hebrew is the majority of what I teach, but biblical and religious studies more broadly. I'm doing a topics in biblical theology class, New Testament use of Old. I've taught religious studies, Judaism, and then Islam actually a number of times. And so kind of cool to see how even focusing on Hebrew and the Old Testament, and to be able to study the other major monotheistic Abrahamic religions. So
yeah, that's great. Very good. Good. So your new books, they just came out. Tell us about them. Illustrated Graded Reader for Biblical Hebrew in 2 volumes, and both came out simultaneously. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, and I could tell a little bit of a story with it, going back to when Marissa and I had taken that Hebrew class through Biblical Language Center back in 2014. I had, what Marissa and I had done, that was actually the beginning stages of what are known as our picture Hebrew flashcards, where Hebrew flashcards and then a picture on one side and Hebrew word on the other. That was initially for Marissa to learn the vocabulary. So I was, seminary trained grammar translation, and then started doing Randall Booth's Hebrew materials. But when I was doing it, Marissa tagged along with me, studying at home. And when we had gotten to the 3rd book, Sefer Gimel, the 500 friends and something or another, and the 500 friends was an alphabetized vocabulary list with English glosses, and we had kind of left the pictures like a long time ago, and Marissa especially really missed that. And so we did the picture flashcards initially just for Marissa. And then actually similarly, the beginnings of the Jonah book were in Sefer Beit. We had largely left the pictures behind with that. And what she had done was just in the block text, you learn a paragraph at a time, whatever. And she would just do like a little doodle above the words. And so it was initially very early stages just for Marissa to learn it. And so then we had shown up to the Hebrew class, and we had, the first edition of those flashcards we had done it pretty fast to get it done before Marissa had given birth. And she quickly drew something. I traced it with a marker, a Sharpie, and then wrote the Hebrew on the back. And she wasn't comfortable writing the Hebrew, so I wrote on the back. And then when we showed our classmates, they thought it was kind of cool and wanted a copy. And then that made us think like, oh, maybe we could do this better. And well, it was actually that summer too, where I had an idea of, and I had asked my Hebrew instructors if they thought it was a good idea and if they wanted to take it and run with it. I was like, hey, we're doing, we do storytelling. And we act out the stories and we ask questions about the stories. And, but the stories are using a lot of infrequent vocabulary. Like, what if we did a series of stories that used all and only the most common vocabulary? And so that was the initial idea for the stories, the illustrated graded reader that we ended up doing. And my instructors, I'm not quite sure why they didn't think it was a great idea. Maybe they thought it was an exhausting idea or too limiting to creativity or do natural Hebrew or whatever. It was more the mindset of like, no, just like a natural approach to Hebrew. And so don't put any like limits on it. You'll make it less natural. And so, but I thought it was still a good idea. And it wasn't until a couple years of teaching a community ed Hebrew class that I felt comfortable like taking a first crack at those stories myself. Mm-hmm. And so, and I did. And the goal was the picture Hebrew flashcards is just all the vocabulary that occur 100 times or more in the Hebrew Bible. And there's 417 flashcards. The goal was to use all and only those 417 flashcards. And that was the goal. And we didn't make it, but I think we still accomplished something pretty cool. We were able to do 330 of those picture Hebrew flashcards are in the graded reader. And it's not all of the picture Hebrew flashcards, and it's also not only the picture Hebrew flashcards. So I tried to keep less frequent vocabulary at a rate of like 5% or maybe less. And so like 95% is what, by time they reach that story and learning the flashcards, they're just really familiar with those words. And so they can see it in context, in usage now. And so that's the stories. And so what it is, and I took a very a contrary to the intuition of my instructors in the early days, I took a very not natural approach or to creating the stories. Or what I should say is I wrote the stories very much created by deductive principles. And so every story I wanted, again, the goal was all and only initially. And then I wanted to stage it where every story teaches a limited number of new vocabulary. What I ended up settling on was every story teaches exactly 15 new words. Exactly 15 new words. And then every story grows in length, and it kind of varied. Initially, like my first crack at it, the variance was like between 5 and 10 words, it'll grow in length. If the previous story was 45 words, the next story could be 50 words, or it could be 55 words. And so, but what I ended up settling on was every story grows in total length by exactly 6 words. And what a word is for Hebrew, I decide is just like, if you get rid of the makafs and then you have a space, it's just anything that's a space, is the words. And then I also ended up, every story uses a certain kind of verb type, and 9 verbs of that verb type. And so for call verbs, where you have your default, like your strong verbs. Mm-hmm. So the first story uses only those, so nothing with a weak root. And then the second story teaches or uses 9 verbs of those hollow verbs, biconsonantals, whatever you call them. And then the next story is third hey verbs. And so every story uses 9 of a certain verb type. And then every story adds like 1 new grammar morphological point. Well, actually, it teaches a few of those. Okay. And so it ended up being this like really big puzzle. And it became really, really complex. And with like complexity, it started with like a little bit of complexity. But as I would teach using these stories. I taught using these stories in Minnesota, I think 3 times. And then every time I taught, I would go back and I would revise my stories. So like during the summer, I would make tweaks. So I came up with this system of like taking notes on, hey, why did I have a certain construction and make it a certain way? And what's my justification for saying this, that this kind of novel Hebrew phrase is still good biblical Hebrew. And then that it even fits well within this new context. So even if I take it from a biblical verse, doesn't mean it's going to be just as grammatical in this new context as it was there. So like have to do a fair bit of justification. Well, you can imagine the justification maybe the first time that I wrote, I actually had no justification. I just did it. And then I should probably have some justification. And so then I had a way of having like a footnote per line and then having justification. And then I come back to it the next year. And then I read what I wrote and it doesn't quite feel right. And then I look at my justification. I'm like, that hardly proves. And then so I have to do some like more research. And maybe the more research proves or further supports my earlier thought, or now it's changing it. And so these stories changed in quite a bit over the years. And then I taught even a few times at Sattler before I put them in their final form. And so I described a fair bit of complexity, but the complexity grew over time, and it did grow over time because when I made the transition from Minnesota to Boston, I had learned about something called embedded reading, and so it was one of my students in the community ed class was a TPR Spanish teacher. And she had been doing it for 10 years or whatever. And she said, it took me 5 years teaching TPR Spanish until I actually felt like I was a good Spanish teacher. And I was like, that's actually kind of comforting because I'm in year 4 of teaching Hebrew. Like maybe next year I'll be a good Hebrew teacher. And so she does a lot of like research in second language acquisition. She goes to these TPR conferences and stuff. And so she had come across a concept called embedded readings. And so basically it's telling the story multiple times over, and each time the story grows in length and complexity. And so and there's different ways of creating these stories. So the end result is the story grows in length and complexity, and everything in the first version is in the second version, is in the third version. And you could write it that way to begin with, or you could reverse engineer it, which is what I did, because I had my stories. And so at that time, every story, right, grows in total length by a certain number of words, and then adds 15 new vocabulary words, uses 9 of a certain verb type, and teaches a few bite-sized grammar points. And so then what I did was, from the full version, I ended up creating the first 2 embedded versions of the story. And what I did was, again, and I guess this, maybe all this shows is a little bit of like a personality type, but I was ruthless to myself of I'm going to take this in exact thirds. And so if the first story is 41 Hebrew words long. And so my first, which is an odd number and isn't divisible by 3. And so I have a choice of the first version can be 13 words long or 14 words long. But I need to do 14 and then 13, or 13 plus 14, whatever. So I'm going to take it it's going to be exactly 1/3 the length, the first version. And that first version is going to teach exactly 1/3 of the new vocab words, which is 5, exactly 1/3 of the grammar points, exactly 1/3 of the verb type. And then the next versions are going to add that third, the second third, and then the third third. And so then that's what I did when I came to Boston. And so then this is all features of the graded reader.
Right.
The graded reader is, the 2 volumes are 16 stories that grow in this kind of length and complexity that I've talked about. It doesn't infinitely grow in length. I mean, basically, it grows by exactly 6 until you get to 100 words, and then the pace slows down even more. And I think the longest story number 16, is something like 112 words. So there's 16 stories. The first 2 stories are just fictional stories. I made them up. Although the very first story, I'm kind of riffing off of a biblical story. The final 14 stories, and this was kind of controversial in my small circles of Hebrew pedagogy, of, do you teach a familiar story, or is that actually cutting against the possible learning, right? So if like students aren't learning to read, they're just learning to decode if they're familiar, once they catch what the story is, then they start doing a matching game. Oh, this is that and that's that. And maybe you don't really learn it that way. But I came at it from a different angle, and it's, well, one is, you can only dangle the carrot in front of the student who wants to learn biblical Hebrew for so long before you let them start eating from the carrot, or let them eat the carrot and give them another thing. That the reason why any 90 whatever percent of Christians who are interested in reading or learning biblical Hebrew is to better read the Old Testament. And so let's get there sooner than later. And if we can do, and if we do a condensed, slightly edited version of the story, then, well, it's so condensed, students aren't actually quite sure exactly what's coming next. And so it does, because not everything in the biblical story is going to end up in this small version of the story. And so, not quite sure exactly what's coming next. And so there's still actually a layer of unfamiliarity to it. But if, so in some ways what I did was I created just like a Hebrew children's Bible. I mean, in some ways.
Uh-huh.
But I tried to, in some ways, perhaps maybe do it a little bit more carefully and responsibly than what a lot of people do with less liberty than what a lot of people do with children's Bibles in English, say. And my goal, and what I tell my students, is once we get into the biblical stories, I'm confident that I can show you insights into the biblical story that you've never seen before, even just based on this version. And for my own students, I have a 1-page write-up of each of the stories, and I give it to them. There's a lot of extra resources that I link to in the graded readers, and my own personal interpretation I didn't put in there because, well, I wanted to keep it more on grammar and translation, and felt less of a responsibility of like interpreting theology for this. Let's see, and so yeah, the first 2 fictional, the last 14 are biblical stories. And so then the 2 volumes, first volume is the first 8 stories, second volume is the second 8 stories. Well, so that was the creation of the the text and the nuts and bolts kind of behind it. It's kind of, so it's designed like quite rigorously with like deductive principles, but then it gives students kind of an inductive language experience of, why. So with once I get around to publishing the grammar companion, I mean, the grammar is way differently arranged than just a typical deductive grammar. We're going to cover all the same stuff, but it's going to come in quite a different order, because it's not just simply logically arranged. And so it gives students an inductive experience of like, I'm learning these vocabulary words in order to learn this story. Why these vocab words? Because it shows up in the story. Why this verb type? Because it shows up in this story. Why these grammar points? Because it shows up in the story. And it's like, but then there's a question of like, well, why did it show up in the story? And then that's where it's like the back end of what I explained. But that's like the text of the story. For the 2-volume graded reader, I sat on it for quite a while. Like I because I kept making changes, I was terrified to publish it because, because I make tweaks and changes like almost every year. So there hasn't been a year gone by that I haven't like tweaked something. And so what if I publish it and then, then other people start tweaking it? I'm like, oh, I'm a fool. I published too early. And so that when I was like, I think I'm close. And when I thought like, I think this next time, if I do it right, I think this could be the last year. And I tried to raise up a team, as big a team as I could, of other Hebraists to be able to check my work. And what was nice there is I had provided all of the justification. And so I gave them the documents and just like, hey, question me. Like, if you don't think I have a proper justification, or, you don't necessarily have to tell me I'm wrong, but even just questioning like, are you right about this, will be helpful. And if you could tell me I'm wrong, and then what would be the right way of saying it, that would be even better. So that was one thing that I did a few years ago. And then it was to get it illustrated. And And then that's where my wife comes in, and we had done a lot of illustrating. And so you would think like, well, duh, you had it planned all along for Marissa to illustrate this. She illustrated the picture flashcards. She was the conceptual artist for the Jonah book. She would illustrate this as well. And it's like, well, actually, not quite, because we started it when we just had one child, and now we're actually expecting our sixth child. I was just saying before we jumped on, we're expecting our sixth child in 2.5 weeks, and my wife homeschools the children. Our oldest is 10 years old, and so my wife is tremendously busy. And then we wanted to do full color illustrations, and Marissa had never done anything color, just black and white, pen, pencil, even transitioning to the medium of having like a drawing iPad. She would mimic the pencil and pen with iPad. And so she was intimidated of doing anything color. She had never done anything color. Well, I had pursued a few different people over the years, and I grew and it was just never traction. And I grew impatient, and I begged and I pleaded. And I also said, like, you don't have to. Nearly 2 years ago, she said, okay, I'll do it. And she watched YouTube videos and was able to use the app called Procreate, and she did an amazing job. And one of the tricks that we learned a fair ways into doing the flashcards was, if you take a picture of someone on your device doing the action, or if it's an in motion action where there's motion, you can't just do it with a picture, right? You can't say, okay, run, and then have someone like freeze frame and run. Like, that's not running. And so, but we learned for that is take a slow motion movie and then do a freeze frame. And so you get a picture out of it, right, and then import it into the app, set it as the background to the canvas, increase the transparency, and then trace it. And so then, boy, that cuts down a lot on the time, because now all of your proportions are just right. And she was going off of a certain style of realism or cartoonism, and she watched some videos of how to do that. And so we were able to use our students at Sattler College. Every weekend we have 4 students over for a brunch on Saturday morning. I pick them up, drop them off, spend a couple hours together, just hanging out. And what we did for like a semester or more was, hey, we're going to be doing this story this week. And I would prioritize having students that had already done the stories with me, learned them, acted them out. And so, so they felt even more comfortable to like kind of emote and act out and bring some creativity to it. And we did it as such of like, okay, if we have a character, Moses, how many different stories does Moses occur in? So then whoever our Moses is has to be here.
He has to keep being Moses.
Yeah, has to keep being Moses. Well, that was actually even big as far as having like character continuity of, what will his dress look like? But then also being able to have the facial features and whatever. And so, that was really nice of, just being able to give a broad variety of what characters can look like. I was just like, hey, they're as varied as the students are. Try to keep it, try to limit the anachronisms as much as possible. Give the guys big beards and whatever. and try to give it more of like a Middle Eastern look on skin tone, etc. And so, boy, I mean, the first, so the plan was to publish these at different times, one this year, one next year. And the first volume took Marissa something like 15 months. And then, I mean, kind of because we're crazy, she's right now in beginning a master's program. It's slow paced. She's just taking one class at a time.
Okay.
But we had kind of decided for her to begin her master's program. And then we had this summer and we're like, what if we just had what if we just like went hardcore at this? Like, I'm a professor. I don't teach summer classes. I can spend time with the kids. Honestly, this is going to be a great summer if I spend 4 extra hours with the kids each day. And so the plan was to have Marissa illustrate 5 hours a day this summer. We didn't quite keep that pace, but it was enough to just crank it out. She finished volume 2, which is longer, a lot longer, actually. She finished volume 2 in like less than 3 months. So that was the illustrations. What she did was amazing. The other feature that I should mention, and boy, I've been talking for a long time.
No, this is great. You're giving us all kinds of good background information. I'm enjoying it. Keep going.
Is the video companion elements to it. So this is also something that I did not have in mind. I never even dreamed about this several years ago. Didn't dream of it when we were in Minnesota. We've been in Massachusetts now. I'm in my 7th year at Sattler College. And is the video element component to it. And so it started with, in Minnesota, we had always taught the stories to students in person, with first acting out, like having these puppets. So Marissa would kind of act it out with the characters, and I would read it, and we would do a question and answer in front of the students, showing students, and then invite students after we went through the whole story to then have them act it out. So you've seen it acted out, you've heard it, and then now you do it. And it came to us somewhere along the line within the first few years, maybe it was even at the tail end of our time in Minnesota, was, you know what, this whole thing, we could easily just do in a video and then teach students outside class. And then I can have class time more like dialogical, the back and forth kind of stuff that you can only do in person. And so like whatever I don't have to do in person, like can I put, and so part of the, I guess flipped classroom model. So like a lecture, like a grammar lecture. So I do some, I have English grammar lectures for my class, and or grammar lectures in English about Hebrew grammar. And so I would record those and assign them outside of class. Similarly, with the videos that are featured in the book with QR codes, is that it started with this idea of like, I don't need to do this in class. And it started, so at first it was all the Q&A was all in third person. It was a lot of like, so I read something and then ask questions about like basically who did what, why did he do it, where and whatever, but we're all just talking about the characters in the story. And well, that's great because that's giving you some different verbal forms to work with, and you're hearing it in slightly different ways. But it's all just third person. And I realized in time at Sattler of like, well, I also want them to be able to work with first person, second person forms, and with this need to have a dialogue. And then that's also a feature in the videos where along the lines I was like, oh wait, hey, instead of just asking with my co-creator, who did he do, what did he do, is actually engage with the characters in the story. And when it started with an idea of one of my students at Sattler. We have a capstone project of a 12 credit capstone project. And so one student wanted to do a project with me in Hebrew. And so Brevin is his name, and then he's the one who's featured with me in the stories. And anyway, so then we tackled this big project of creating all of these stories, and each one of the teaching stories, if it's something like 10 minutes long, it probably took 10 man hours to create, just with writing out the dialogue, preparing the puppets. We would hit record on the camera and then just let it record, and we would have like a full hour of recording and then have to trim that down to 10 minutes. And so then that's the basis of the videos. And then there's 3 different kinds of videos with QR codes that help teach and act out, or a different way of kind of presenting the story with audio and visual. And so thankful to Sattler College for enabling us to be able to do it, Brevin, in doing this mammoth project. I mean, all total, we created, I think, something like 11 or so. It was more than 10 hours of final cut version. So we're like, hey, that's longer. It's longer than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Take that, Peter Jackson. So yeah, that's and being able to put all that together in this 2-volume set, and finally get it out there. So yeah, it's a big relief, and it's turned into a much more mature project and multifaceted project. Actually, I guess in a sense, kind of accidentally, as I just kind of marinated on it, and the complexity of it just kind of grew over time, and the companion resources, and then Marissa being able to just do amazing illustrations.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, this is great, and thank you. It's so fun to get a inside look into how it all came together, and so just a couple quick questions, if you don't mind, to
Yeah.
wrap things up a little bit. First of all, what did you find easy to do, and all this explanation? What was particularly challenging for in the process?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, particularly challenging was, especially with the first several stories, with all of the constraints that I put on myself. Of, I'm going to limit the number of new anything that students are going to encounter to be able to write a story. That was easily the most challenging aspect of it. But I am so glad that I did it, because I think we quickly forget how overwhelming it all is for beginning Hebrew students, beginning language students, and we probably overwhelm them more than we should. I mean, the goal should be lifelong learning, and we shouldn't expect that, or I think it's kind of tragic if we were to kind of have the expectation of students when they finish, a 2-year sequence of language with us, that this is going to be their pinnacle. Like, it's only kind of downhill from here. It's kind of like, of like, how full is your cup of language knowledge? And so here's your vessel, and then I'll fill it, and I fill it, and I'm the one to fill it with water. You can't fill it with water yourself afterwards. And then the goal is keeping it, full, and not, bumping it. And so you only get less from here, not more. I'm like, why? And so, but if the goal is actually launching them, and if, a common question is, well, how do I keep up my Hebrew or my Greek? It just read. I mean, once you get to the point of you can do your devotions, your daily devotions in Greek and Hebrew, I've called that like cutting the English umbilical cord. If you don't need English to sustain the English medium to get spiritual nourishment from the Bible, once you cut that, and you can do it in Greek and Hebrew, then keeping up languages is as simple as reading your Bible. But it takes a lot of energy to get lift off there. If it's something like, I don't know, say you have a satellite that goes around, that's in the Earth's orbit. It took a lot of energy from the rocket to be able to get that satellite up into space. And so it's a lot of energy to get takeoff with languages to be able to get to the point of reading. But if you can, and once you get out there, and then if you're in the Earth's orbit of it, just reading daily, regularly in Greek and Hebrew, that's what's sustaining. So anyway, that was the most difficult part of it. The easiest part was being able to collaborate with other people. I've just become such a huge fan of collaboration. This project was so much richer in the memories of it, richer in the sense of achievement, but then richer even in the quality, from collaboration with my wife, a collaboration with students, and two students feature really prominently in that collaboration. But even all the collaboration of having them come over and take pictures.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So this is really meeting a need that we have within the field of particularly Hebrew language instruction, to get in their hands something that is accessible, something that is comprehensible. Because as I've talked about up to this point in the podcast series, that acquisition is a byproduct of comprehension. And if you can't comprehend the text, you're not going to get anywhere. And so you're really bringing us comprehensible input in a way that's interesting and engaging, but we need more. And so for those who are listening who might be interested in trying their hand at something like this, what would you recommend? How would you encourage them to go about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of start, and if and it's if you don't, and if, well, I assume that people would have Bible software and whatever to be able to do these morphological and syntax searches. That for me was, absolutely basic and fundamental. From how do I spell this? And if this form doesn't occur, and if there's some funky stuff going on with this word, other searches that I can do to have some kind of like comparison. I mean, that was kind of like most basic, but I mean, honestly, the with verbs and how do they express themselves in uh, I'm struggling to know exactly what kind of grammatical terms to use here. But of the arguments of the verbs, of like a subject, complement, does it take direct object, or is it expressed with a prepositional phrase, etc. And then, also distrusting, well, just because you have an English gloss, that this word functions in Hebrew, like how that English gloss functions in English. And so in creating any kind of novel biblical Hebrew, having a really healthy amount of distrust of like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, and having to like search and verify. And yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to go about it as to a crazy degree that I did, but to write down your justification, even if it's just for a line of text, cross-reference these few verses, and then if you come back to it, and hopefully you will, and you question yourself, then you'll know at least what you were thinking last time you were looking at it.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Um, Anything else you would like to share with our listeners before we sign off?
Yeah. And also to be able to hopefully have somewhat of a community too. If you're producing resources, we do need more resources, and to also be able to have people read and interact with your work. We need a lot more resources at the beginning level. We also need a lot more resources at the intermediate level. I'll say another like kind of project that I've been working on, I'm not quite sure will come from this, was partnering with another one of former Sattler students who majored in computer science. And he and I were able to develop kind of an app to be able to come up with a multi-variable analysis of easy to read Hebrew paragraphs. So
Okay.
it all started with, I got a PDF. It's entitled something like 100 Easiest Chapters to Read in Biblical Hebrew. And it's a monovariable, a single variable analysis of just like, basically it's the concentration of infrequent vocabulary. The greater concentration of infrequent vocabulary means the harder it is to read. And that's useful. That's very useful. But it also was lacking. It was lacking in that it was chapters, and chapters often aren't natural blocks of text. It was also lacking in that the vocabulary isn't the only determiner of what makes a passage easy or hard to read. There's morphology stuff going on, there's syntax stuff going on, and he was able to import a tagged Hebrew text and then use the Masoretic markings for the paragraph markings. And he gave me a wonderful machine to be able to just play with, of like, I mean, basically I can select almost anything to use, and then have that and then assign it a point total. If it's this kind of a verb, if it's this kind of a stem, if it's this kind of an inflection, or if it has this an attached pronoun, or if it's this kind of syntactic construction, and I can give it a point total. And this was actually pretty exciting to be able to do, and I wonder what could come from this,
Right.
because there are other graded readers out there, and I look at them and I compare them with what actually I found. I'm like, in what sense is this a graded reader? Like, I think it's a graded reader, but it's all more just like intuition and nothing like really serious as far as like actually what's easy to read Hebrew.
Right.
And so just to like set students up for success is what you're talking about with comprehension.
Right.
Set them up for success and let them feel the joy and the satisfaction of like, I can do this. And if you do that enough, then they'll be able to keep going.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Thank you, Jesse. It's been great to talk with you today.
Yeah.
And we wish you all the best. Your graded readers are available at Glossa House. Is that correct?
Yep.
And I assume Amazon and other places.
Yeah.
So thank you for your contribution. And for Marissa, I'm sorry she couldn't join us, but please thank her also for us. So it's been great having you. Take care, and we'll hope to connect again another time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.